Morning all. We're just going to wait until a few more participants come in. We're just up over the first 100, but we've got quite a few to get in, so bear with us. Okay, the clock's hit 10:31, so I feel it's time to welcome everybody to Trowers and Hamlin's mini conference on building safety. Mini because it's only being held over 2 days, today and tomorrow, but maxi because we have 6 jam-packed sessions full of fantastic speakers from government and industry. Just a few housekeeping issues to start off with. We are recording all of the sessions and they will be emailed out to you afterwards and available on the Trowers and Hamlin's website, www.trowers.com. So feel free to sit back and enjoy rather than taking copious amounts of notes, because these will be available afterwards. The conference, as I've said, is split over 2 days with 3 sessions per day. Before I introduce my fellow speakers, I'd like to just quickly go through the running order today. At 11 o'clock, we have construction and development, looking at gateways in the golden thread, with Mike Hutchison from Vistry Partnerships, James Cousins from NG, and chaired by my fantastic colleague, Teresa Mohammed. At 11:30 till 12 o'clock, we have the Regulator, Sanctions and Enforcements. So a slightly more controversial subject, and that will be led by Chris Auger from BAFE, chaired by Amanda Stubbs, my other fantastic colleague today from Trowers, and also Paul Mooney from Salix, one of the early adopters group. But now we're going to kick off with an overview of the draft safety bill. And I've tasked my speakers, Damien and Paul, today with giving you 5 things that you need to know about the draft safety bill. Now, the draft bill is the latest iteration of the continuing conversation that we've been having as a sector since the Grenfell Tower fire and Dame Judith Hackett's report and recommendations that addressed some of the shortcomings in the sector following and identified from that fire. It's MHCLG's legislative response to that. And so I'm going to introduce to you my first speaker, Damien. Damien Dacey is a Deputy Director of the Building Safety Team at MHCLG, so is perfectly placed to give us the insider's view today. And secondly, Paul Nash. Paul is a member and past president of the Chartered Institute of Building. He is also sitting on the Industry Safety Steering Group, chaired by Dame Judith Hackett. And for our sins, we sit together on the MHCLG Procurement Advisory Group as well. So I couldn't welcome 2 better placed and expert and even competent speakers to talk to us today. So first off, Damien, can I introduce you and ask you to kick off with your 5 things we need to know about the draft bill?
Thanks, Rebecca. Do shout if you can't hear me or if I go a bit muffled. Having just returned yesterday from 4 weeks of shared paternity leave, I can say it's the first time in a while that I've been called competent. So thank you. Thank you for that. So I'm one of the deputy directors in the building safety program. My responsibility is building safety legislation. So the primary and then the emerging program, extensive program of secondary. So thanks for inviting me. It's good to be here to talk about our bill. So let me see if I break this down into 5 bits. So first of all, what's it about? Number 1. And forgive me if some of you already know some of this stuff, but I figure it's good to sort of establish the baseline, and then we can move on to some more stuff about what's happening next. So first of all, what's it about? The building safety bill, or the draft building safety bill, as I should say. Yeah, it's one of the government's main domestic reform agendas at the minute. What is it reforming? It's aiming to address the systemic issues that were identified by Dame Judith Hackett in her report from a couple of years ago. Those issues you could broadly break down, if you get to the gist of it, into two issues. One, how did a fire like Grenfell happen? One, systemically, there's a failure of regulation and a failure of leadership and culture. So the reforms broadly aim to address those two things, and much of the bill is about fixing the regulatory side of that, but also putting in place the right kind of carrots and sticks to then incentivize the leadership and the culture change, which I know that Paul will say a bit more about. So the bill itself is putting in place this, an updated statutory framework focused on building safety and performance standards. It applies to all buildings, but there is a particular focus on a certain set of buildings that warrant even closer oversight because of the potential of significant consequences should a fire spread or the structure of the building failed. And this is the more stringent regime. This is buildings where the risk is deemed greatest, and where there is a need to protect the greatest number of people. And so initially the scope of this more stringent regime will apply to buildings over 18 meters or more in height, or more than six stories, and multi-occupied residential buildings of broadly that height, whichever is reached first. And the regime is designed so that it can be changed if the evidence base or operational experience says that it should. So the bill, that's the kind of framework, and the intent is to put in place a stronger, clearer framework, so to make sure that those people who are managing building safety risks in higher risk buildings are held to account. So there'll be stronger enforcement powers and sanctions. The regulator, the new building safety regulator, which is being established in the HSE in shadow form at the minute, will sit at the centre of that and oversee this. The intent, of course, is to ensure that residents of such buildings have a stronger voice, alongside giving them better access to safety information about their building, clarifying their rights, and providing recourse on safety concerns. So there's the sort of residents angle to it too. So that's the kind of first bit. So what's it about? The second bit I would say is sort of then what's in it, and why this draft bill. As I said, the bill, it's a pretty big bit of legislation. It breaks down into 5 parts. Once you get the sort of introductory bit out of the way, the first part establishes the regulator within the HSE and defines the scope of the regime and many of the regulator's powers. Then you have what we call Part 3, which essentially deals with amendments to the Building Act. Essentially, this is the regime, the kind of more stringent regime, the bulk of this part of the Act anyway, of the bill. The bulk of it is dealing with how the new regime will operate for the design and build stages of the life cycle. So this is where things like powers that will enable things like how the new gateways will operate come in. But there's also lots of other stuff that broadly sit under the hood of updates to the Building Act. Part 4 is the relatively novel and interesting part of it. So that's all of the new provisions. So this is new bits of statute rather than updating older bits of statute, for how the regime, the more stringent regime for higher risk buildings, operates once they are occupied. And then Part 5 deals with a bunch of other stuff that we felt needed to be dealt with in this bill, including stuff like updates to the regime for construction products. So as I just whiz through those 5 parts there, why publish it in draft? Okay, so number 3, why publish it in draft? The answer is this is big and complicated stuff. I think the Secretary of State's wording in his recent WMS is, these are extensive reforms and it's incumbent on us to get it right. And that pretty much says it all. It is a big and large and complex and technical piece of legislation. It reflects the scale of change that's needed. So ministers are absolutely clear that they want to get it right, and so have asked us to publish it in draft for pre-led scrutiny, from Parliament, because there's a parliamentary process. That's what it's for, pre-led scrutiny, but also so that it can get out there, so that industry, regulatory bodies, residents and groups representing them can see it and have a chance to understand it, digest it, and then feedback on it. So, the department wants constructive, wholehearted engagement to strengthen these proposals, because we want to do our best to ensure that residents are protected in the future. So just finally, parts 4 and 5, I just want to say something about timelines and then secondary and transition. So timelines, there's not a huge amount. I mean, if somebody wants to ask me more about this, I could say a bit more. But there's not a huge amount more I can say apart from the fact that we're at this stage in the process. We published the draft bill before the summer recess, which is what ministers had committed to. Got there just in the nick of time before the House rises and I went on shared paternity leave. So, but as I said, these are important measures. This is and it's been said about these reforms in the past, this is a once in a generation update to the statutory framework here. So we want to get it right, but also because they are such important public safety measures, we want to get on with it too. And put this stuff in place. So there is a tricky balance there. Pre-leg scrutiny has now started. The committee will do their deliberations. I suspect that they will produce their report by the end of the year, and then I expect that we will produce our response to it within the 8 weeks that we're usually expected to do that. And then the next task is getting ready to introduce it, to find a slot in the parliamentary timetable. So that's the timelines. Fifth, I just want to say something about secondary and transition. I think I'm breaching my 6 to 8 minute slot here. Sorry, Paul. So there is lots of detail that's been left in the secondary. The bill, a bit like the Building Act itself, is a sort of an enabling framework in many areas. And if you read the bill, you will see that there are a number approaching, if not exceeding 3 figures, where it says the Secretary of State may make regulations too. Okay, so all of those regulations need to be written. The thing I would say is they will all be done under the thrust of the policy intent that has been extensively consulted on and publicised in Dame Judith's report, in the Building a Safer Future consultation. But we expect, of course, as the bill gets published, Parliament wants to see sight of some draft regs too, which may, of course, bring forward some of their publication. The second part of it is then transition. So, this is for the Building Safety Regulator to consider, as well as our department. For new buildings, the more stringent regime will apply throughout their life cycle from the time it becomes statute and is commenced. So this means that things like the person accountable for the building will have to register the building before it comes occupied at Gateway 3, for example. So to do so would not be an offence. But of course, the important thing is, well, what about existing buildings? As the new regime comes into force, they will need to be transitioned into the new regime. And the regime will apply an occupation, and there will need to be a suitable phased transition period. And so, more detail will need to be produced and circulated on that as the policy develops. So that was a whistle-stop tour of the bill and the process. Hope that helps, Rebecca.
Thank you, Damien. Before I hand over to Paul, I should just say there is a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. 2 of you have already asked questions. Please do feel free to ask them, because after Paul's given his presentation, we will have time to answer some of them. So please do that. That's great. Thanks, Paul.
That's great. Thanks, Rebecca. And hopefully everyone can hear me clearly. Damien, that was an excellent summary of the draft bill and what's in it. So rather than repeat what Damien has just covered, I want to cast the net slightly wider, and I'd like to touch on some of the key themes that came out of the second report of the Industry Safety Steering Group that was published last month. So just by way of background, the Safety Steering Group was established in December 2018, and it was part of the government's response to the Building a Safer Future report. And that report, amongst other things, called on government to help create a culture change and a more responsible building industry. The group, which is made up of representatives of a number of different industry sectors, is chaired by Dame Judith Hackett, and it reports directly to the Secretary of State for Housing, Communities and Local Government. So we meet bi-monthly, and our purpose is to provide constructive challenge to the industry. And in the last year, we've heard from some 40 organisations, and we've explored a number of issues such as competence, building control, professional indemnity insurance, building contracts, procurement, and most recently the golden thread. So as well as determining what action is needed to accelerate culture change in industry, we also look to highlight examples of best practice. And we look to celebrate those organisations also that are pushing ahead with changes that are needed now rather than waiting for legislation. And I'll come back to that at the end of this short presentation. So the first topic I'd like to talk about really is an issue that came to the attention of the group last year. It was already making headlines at that time, and that was the issue of unsafe cladding and the uncertainty about whether a building was unsafe or not was affecting leaseholders' ability to buy, sell, insure and remortgage their properties. And you might remember that this was a result of government advice at the time that had made building owners responsible for checking that the external wall systems on their buildings were safe. The problem was that landlords were reluctant to carry out the necessary checks and individual leaseholders couldn't afford to do so. But there was also no agreed process for the inspection of an external wall system that would allow a suitably qualified surveyor to provide the required sign-off. So in December last year, the group heard from the RSCS, the UK Finance and the Building Society Association. And we were encouraged to learn that together with lenders, valuers and other industry representatives, they'd come up with a solution. And that solution was the external wall fire review process and the EWS4. And it was an important step forward. Now in practice, the process has not been without its challenges, but it did show to the group what the industry could achieve when it worked together to solve a problem. But that also highlighted another industry, and that was the lack of suitably qualified and competent fire engineers to undertake the required assessments, an issue which the group has since raised with the Institute of Fire Engineers. But as we know, the issue of competence and capacity is wider than one discipline, and that's the second topic I'd like to touch on. In August last year, the Competency Steering Group published its interim report entitled Raising the Bar, and the report set out measures to raise standards of competencies for those who design, construct, inspect, maintain and operate higher risk buildings. The final report, which is entitled Setting the Bar, is due to be published soon, but the work to set standards has been ongoing in the meantime. And earlier this year, we heard from the British Standards Institute, which has set up the Built Environment Competence Standards Strategy Group, or BEX for short, to lead and coordinate the development of standards for the 3 duty holder roles under the new building safety regime, i.e. the principal designer, principal contractor, and the building safety manager. And that follows directly on from the work of the steering group's Working Group Zero, which developed the overarching competency framework. But the discussion about competency raises an important question for professional bodies. How are they going to ensure that their members, who are going to be duty holders under the Act, not only have the required technical knowledge, but demonstrate the right behaviours? My own professional body, the Chartered Institute Building, is about to launch a series of training modules on building safety. But alongside this, we're also considering the process that we need in place to assess and assure the competence of our members performing these roles. And this has raised another important question. As an industry, how will we ensure that there are sufficient trained and competent people to perform these duty holder roles by the time that the new Building Safety Bill becomes law? It's an issue that I highlighted in an article in Construction Manager recently. And I was encouraged to learn that some organisations, such as Trafford Housing, have already taken the initiative and are recruiting people to perform this role now. Third topic I'd like to touch on quickly is the golden thread. We know that one of the issues highlighted by the Building Safety Future report was a lack of complete, accurate and up-to-date building information. And that report recommended the need for robust record keeping with a digital golden thread of key building information running through all phases of design, construction and occupation. Now, although the term golden thread is referred to a lot these days, it doesn't appear in the draft bill itself. And that's because there's no agreed legal definition of the golden thread. And it's a term that's often used in other industries, but in different contexts. So although the draft bill doesn't refer to it specifically, there are provisions within it to help create a golden thread. And it's referenced in the explanatory notes and defining the glossary of terms. So the intention is clear, as is the recognition that the golden thread is a key concept underpinning the new building safety regime. So last month, we heard from a number of organisations that are already working to embed the golden thread in new and existing housing stock. The CIOB is undertaking an online survey to investigate the construction industry's understanding of the golden thread, and I'd encourage those who haven't done so already to go to the website www.goldenthread.co.uk and complete the survey. But one issue that I have highlighted, and Rebecca's aware of this as well, is that this risk that we try to, as I refer to it, eat the elephant whole, when it comes to implementing the golden thread. We do as an industry need to embrace digital technology and the benefits that come from that, but that's a longer term project. In the short term, we need to focus on delivering those elements that are critical to fire life safety. The fourth point, just to quickly touch on here, is building control. Has a key role to play in the new building safety regime. The group met with building control bodies last year. I have to say we were disappointed by the lack of progress and the lack of collaboration at that time. But since then, I'm pleased to say the profession has made great strides forward with the publication in July of the Future of Building Control report. And that sets out recommendations for the future regulation of building control in England. It is a compelling vision, and it's a credit to those organisations that helped to produce it. And it's now essential that vision becomes a reality, particularly given the proposals in the Building Safety Bill, which will see the regulator become the building control authority for buildings in scope, with power to oversee and report on the performance of building control bodies. And of course, it also sees the separation of those who inspect from those who approve, which, as you may recall, was one of the issues highlighted in the Building a Safer Future report. And finally, as you'd expect, and I alluded to it at the front, I'd like to touch on the issue of culture change briefly and the need for leadership. In the last year, it's become clear that some parts of the industry are making real progress, but it's also clear that far too many are waiting for legislation before acting. And given the evidence, that approach is just not acceptable or tenable. The report highlights the need for industry leadership on building safety. And in the coming year, we know as an industry we're going to face a number of challenges for both in terms of the economy and in terms of the industry. But the focus on resident safety remains a priority. So the onus is on our industry to lead and drive the changes now. So my final message is don't wait for the legislation to make the changes that are needed. Get on with it now so that we never have to face another tragedy like Grenfell.
Thanks, Paul. And I think that's echoing what Dame Judith said in her second annual report, that no one should need to wait to be told to behave responsibly. So I think that's the clarion call at the moment. I think we've had some really interesting questions come through. So if we can just, in the die minutes, go on to those. Morning, Mr. Perry. And I think this is a question that I'm very interested in as well. And I'll just talk to Damien about timing of the bill. So in your kind of timeline, are we thinking that this bill is going to receive royal assent spring 2021 or autumn 2021? And then how long do you think you are going to give people who, many people like Birmingham City Council may have hundreds of higher risk buildings. How long have they got to get their shop in order?
Okay, good question. So on the first one, I don't know, we don't expect royal assent by spring 2021. The bill is currently in draft form, so it's not formally been, not started its passage through to royal assent. I mean, if we take the kind of building blocks that need to happen between now and introduction, then you're sort of looking at about a March, April time for the bill to be introduced, because it needs to go through pre-date scrutiny. We need to respond. We need to consider what the committee has said. We need to then get a parliamentary slot, and there's no reason to assume that that there'll be more of those hanging around in March next year than there is now. And then it needs to go through Parliament, and a bill of this size can take 6 to 9 months to do that with a fair wind. And so I think, I mean, it's complete guesswork, but it would be great to get to royal assent of the primary legislation by autumn, post-summer 2021, I think. And then you've got, of course, all of the secondary legislation to come in. So I know there's been some other questions here about transitional arrangements. Now, the regulator is currently in shadow form and is being set up, and it can do stuff and is doing stuff or starting to do stuff in the meantime in order to help prepare for that transition. But of course, what it needs is the legal powers in place, both the primary and the secondary, and then presumably to be publishing some statutory guidance and other things after that. And so by the time you add all of that stuff in, you're sort of talking about quite, you know, it's not next year by the time a lot of these provisions then start to bite in a legal term. You know, it's 2022, you know, but potentially for some buildings after. I suspect that the regulator will want to focus on the higher risk buildings first and foremost in terms of its functions, because it has broader functions alongside it as a building standards overall. But I suspect the regulator will want to focus on those higher risk buildings. But at the minute, there's not a huge amount more that I can say in terms of what the length of that transition period is. But of course, one of the benefits in publishing the bill now is to be able to, for people to start to see, like, what is the shape of this statutory framework. And there's a 1,004 long explanatory note that is published alongside the bill that tries to explain a little bit more about what those powers mean in practice.
Thank you, Damien, because it is quite interesting. When we had the Decent Homes programme, we were given 10 years as an industry to get our homes up to decency. Yeah. And what you said about the political imperative behind this, I don't think MHCLG or the regulator are going to give landlords 10 years to get up to speed. But I think that a lot of landlords are concerned that at the moment, we don't know all of the details, and yet at some point the legislation's going to bite. And actually, if we can bring in another question here, obviously part 2 that deals with a lot of the design and construction phase, a lot of the design and construction information, and part 4, the safety case, is being left to secondary legislation to detail out. And there is a lot of queries around what should the building safety case look like? What should it contain? What level of information do they need to go into? Does there need to be 2 versions, one for the landlord and the fire and rescue services, one for the tenants, to see when will that kind of detail be coming out? And do you think that it will be at the level of detail that landlords can practically use?
Well, in terms of the second question, I mean, yes, absolutely. I hope so. I mean, that's certainly the intent. So it is absolutely true to say that a lot of that detail has been left for the secondary legislation. That is true. The materials published alongside the bill, but try to do 2 things. They try and give where possible or sensible some sort of suggestion about what might be in it. So, for example, on the safety case, they sort of try to explain that it draws on and where Dame Judith got a concept from the world of sort of health and safety practice and other things. But the most important thing I think that we can do at this stage is explain what it's for. So what would it be used for? What kind of, not necessarily the lines of information, but what is the purpose of the information that is in it? And the materials published alongside the bill try to do that as much as possible or sensible to do so at this stage, of course, without putting the cart before the horse, because the regulations are still to be written. So we are in that kind of space where the sort of broad policy intent has been set out. You've got the shape of the statutory framework, but there is a lot of operational detail that we, with the regulator, need to develop. Okay, and it's worth saying, and apologies for just running over a little bit with my answer, but it's worth saying that the development of this can't be done in sort of an ivory tower. Like all of this stuff that we're talking about, especially stuff that's been left for secondary, we are open-eared in terms of wanting to get some feedback from people about about what should or shouldn't be in it.
So if people want to contact you for pre-legislative scrutiny conversations, they can. That's great.
Yeah.
Paul,
I'll put the email in the chat.
Thank you. Paul, in the dying seconds, just picking up on the golden thread and what should be included information-wise, do you have a couple of 1 or 2 pointers about what you think should be concentrated on in that golden thread at the moment?
I think it'll come back to the point that that Damien's just touched on, really. At the different gateways, we're looking for greater definition about what that information is. But I think the principle is, I think there's a key point here that should come through legislation, but it sort of goes back to the original report as well, which is that this is about creating the information that is required to manage the building safety. throughout its life cycle, and ensuring that information is up to date and correct. And that is one of the biggest challenges, I think, a lot of the time, is we know that through a life cycle, a building will be adapted, it will be changed, even if it's something as drilling a hole through a wall to put a data cable through it. You know, and as soon as you do that, the breach the integrity of that wall, and if there's no record of that, how do you know whether or not it's fire safe or not? So I think there is going to be more of a requirement on contractors and designers to, at the early stage, to be clear about what information needs to be captured, but also throughout that process, through design, procurement, and then into operation, ensuring that information is then constantly updated.
Thank you, Paul. We're slightly over. Damien's kindly put the email address for the building safety team in the chat. All that remains for me to say is thank you, Damien and Paul, for kicking off this mini conference. For any other attendees, we do have the Trowers and Hamlin's Essential Guide to Building Safety on our website. It breaks down the 119 clause bill and the 1009 explanatory notes into 16 pages of information. And one client damned it with a faint praise that it was really quite useful. So I commend that to you. And I will thank the speakers again and leave you in the capable hands of Teresa Mohammed now. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Welcome everyone to the Trowers mini conference on building safety, and welcome to those of you who've just joined us just now. Our session is on construction and developments under the building safety regime, gateways and the golden thread. Before I start introducing our speakers, I'd just like to remind you that this session is going to be recorded and available on our website. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A function, and I will try and get to those at the end of the presentations. So first of all, now to introduce our speakers. Mike Hutchison is a chartered member of the Institute of Building with over 20 years experience in the construction industry. Mike is the technical director for Vistry Partnerships in London, and as you would expect, a great deal of Vistry projects involve mixed tenure, estate regeneration, constructing new, medium and high-rise buildings, making Mike someone with a wealth of experience that is relevant to our discussions today. We also have James Cousins. James has 30 years experience working in construction and is the regeneration director for Angie. James has managed and delivered contracts with social landlords across London and the south of England, including all sorts of different work types, including fire safety and whole estate regeneration. James has a degree in quantity surveying. He also has a master's in construction law and a law conversion, and is described as someone that really understands the present regime, which will give us great insight into what we have to do going forward. So I'd like to just introduce you over to Mike now to start his presentation.
Thank you, Teresa, and good morning, everyone. Since the tragic events at Grenfell in 2017, I've closely followed the evolving situation the construction industry has and continues to face. I think it is apparent to most people in the industry that some significant changes are required. Vistry Partnerships, in conjunction with our JV partner, the London Borough of Enfield, have been fortunate enough to have had the opportunity to work recently with MHCLG, the HSE, and the National Fire Chiefs Council to pilot the requirements of Dame Judith Hackett's Building a Safer Future on a large-scale regen project in North London. This has been particularly useful in understanding the potential requirements of Gateway 1. Today, I will explain some of the practical implications the new safety bill is likely to have on the new build construction process for high-risk residential projects. I will also highlight some of the uncertainty that requires further clarification. I'm going to focus on the three proposed new gateways, namely Gateway 1, the planning stage, Gateway 2, prior to works commencing on site, and Gateway 3, prior to occupation, including the golden thread. Before I do that, I'd just like to provide some background to the bill. The bill is perceived by many as the most profound change the industry has seen in over 40 years. The HSE will become the new building safety regulator. They will have three main functions. Firstly, to implement a stringent regulatory regime for higher risk buildings. In essence, this means they will be undertaking the role of building control authority for those projects. Secondly, to oversee the safety and performance of all buildings, including the performance of other building control bodies, such as local authority and approved inspectors. And thirdly, to assist with and encourage competence in the industry, including establishing a unified building control profession. The new bill is likely to become law within the next 12 to 18 months. The HSE are urging all in the industry to adopt the principles of the bill now and to prepare. The bill will introduce greater accountability and responsibility for fire and structural safety issues, including greater sanctions for those who do not comply. Much of the finer construction details will be introduced via secondary legislation, which is to follow. Now, let's take a closer look at the requirements of Gateway 1. The requirements of Gateway 1 will occur before duty holders are required to be in place. It will utilise the existing planning process. The responsibility for meeting the requirements of Gateway 1 must be fulfilled by the party applying for the planning permission where the development contains a high-risk building. The planning application will need to include information which demonstrates the fire safety requirements have been considered. This will take the form of a fire statement. The regulator will become a new statutory consultee in the planning process. They will provide specialist fire safety input to assist local planning authorities. As previously mentioned, the finer details will be defined via secondary legislation. However, discussions Vistry have had with MHCLG on the pilot scheme have provided us with an insight into some of the likely requirements of the fire statement. Two examples being as follows. The fire statement will need to include details of the fire service vehicle access. The planning applicant will need to demonstrate the appropriate firefighting vehicles can move around the site unhindered. To do this with confidence, we will need to know the length, width, and turning circles of firefighting appliances. Is this information readily available to inform the planning process? Is a question that I'd have there. Secondly, access to water supplies. Ensuring sufficient water supplies exist on site is nothing new. However, if demonstrating this becomes a prerequisite to obtaining planning approval, landowners will need to consider how they can secure supplies early. This could mean early payments to water authorities to secure supplies ahead of planning approval. The question I have there is, are water authorities prepared and able to respond to such demands in a timely fashion, and is the infrastructure available? Moving on to Gateway 2. Gateway 2 is to be satisfied prior to construction works commencing on site. It is an enhancement of the current building control full plans deposit stage. It will be the duty holder's responsibility to provide the building safety regulator with their full design intentions. Key information will need to be submitted to and approved by the building safety regulator. This is a hard stop where construction works will not be able to commence until the regulator is satisfied the duty holder's design meets the functional requirements of the building regulations, and it has been demonstrated how the building, once built, will comply with the requirements of the building regulations without any unrealistic safety management expectations. At this point, I want to consider some of the likely implications on projects and the wider construction industry. There will be a requirement for more advanced design prior to commencing works on site. This will include committing to the use of certain products and design solutions earlier in the design process. It will also mean early engagement with specialist contractors, particularly those associated with passive and active fire protection, as their design information will be required as part of the Gateway 2 process. Secondly, the length of pre-construction programs are likely to increase. Undertaking more design in advance of works commencing on site will obviously take longer. In addition, programs will need to take cognizance of the time required by the regulator for their review. Contractors, developers and clients will need to decide what activity, if any, can be progressed with confidence while the regulator assesses the application. Thirdly, it is anticipated Gateway 2 approvals are likely to be accompanied by strict conditions. Consequently, design revisions and changes to specification on products after Gateway 2 approval is likely to require resubmission to the regulator. This is likely to be prohibitive due to the likely cost and program implications. This will also certainly reduce or maybe eliminate the scope for value engineering post Gateway 2. Finally, we now move on to Gateway 3. Following completion of the construction works, the duty holder will be required to submit all prescribed documents and information that represent the final as-built building to the regulator. Once the regulator is satisfied, a completion certificate will be issued which will allow occupation of the building. These prescribed documents and information represent the golden thread and must be handed over to the accountable person who will become the duty holder during occupation. Some of the practical implications, I think, are as follows. The principal designer and the principal contractor will be asked to formally sign off to confirm the building has been constructed in accordance with the building regulations. I just wonder what the assurance implications of this are and who will be responsible for providing the sign-off in each organisation. Will it be a director? Will it be the project manager, etc., etc.? I'm not sure of the answer. Secondly, achieving practical completion for contractors. To achieve practical completion, it's inevitable clients will expect contractors to be in possession of a completion certificate from the regulator. Some of the questions here that I think need consideration. What provisions should be made in contract programs for the duty holder to obtain the completion certificate from the regulator? How long is it likely to take for the regulator to respond to the duty holder? Who is liable should this response time be prolonged? What are the implications if the building safety regulator isn't satisfied with the as-built information? Thirdly, is this when BIM is going to be mandated for high-risk residential buildings? It's very clear to me in the past the industry has failed to accurately record, track changes between design, procurement and construction phases. The new bill stipulates a golden thread of information is to be created and held digitally to help ensure the original design intent and any subsequent changes are captured, preserved and used in the future. What does this actually mean? Duty holders will be expected to start to collect information during the design and construction stage. Will information be required and stored in a particular format and to what level of detail? Will BIM level 2 be the standard required? If so, what does this actually mean? Are contractors and developers already ready to deliver BIM level 2 in the residential market? Will the requirements to asset tag individual building components result in restrictions on products that can be specified? Are specialist contractors ready and able to create and deliver their design solutions in the BIM environment to the required level of detail? And finally, what investment will be required in training, software and hardware? It's clear that those companies already on the BIM journey will have a head start. To finish with, I want to leave you with the following 3 key takeaway messages. The industry must work together in a true collaborative way to implement this bill. Secondly, earlier contractor and specialist contractor engagement must be facilitated in the process. And thirdly, the residential sector needs to prepare itself for BIM to be mandated on high-risk residential buildings. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Mike. That was really interesting. And now can I go over to James, please? James, you're on mute. Thank you.
Hello? You're off, mate? Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for that. And morning, everybody. If you've read the draft bill, or maybe the guide from the draft bill that has been recently circulated by Trowers, you'll see a big generational change coming in legislation. And whilst there's some questions on secondary legislation such as building safety fire, the remit of the building safety manager, it's really down to us as an industry to move this on and contribute to get the best out of the bill we possibly can. So we spoke about moving on, not waiting for the bill. Now I believe it's time to actually start implementing some of these things. So the bill will amend a regulation reform order that gave several parties duty holders. So pleased in the new bill is clear on accountability. You also get that tri-party sign-off at the end of the scheme where the designer, the client and the contractor or constructor will have all sign off that for the building regulator. So in saying that, I'm today going to talk about part 4 of the bill, which establishes the role of the accountable person relevant in the occupation phase. What it means for the contractor, constructor, designer and the client. So the accountable person will need to maintain a safety case risk assessment for the building and appoint a building safety manager to oversee it day to day. And the industry believes that we're going to need in between 2,000 to 2,500 building safety managers in the future. And that roughly looks at, there's estimates between 5 and 10 in-scope buildings that each building safety manager will look at. So if you look at upskilling, we look at culture and training, we're looking as an industry of an extra kind of 2,500 people. So if you look at your own organisations, you can roughly work out in-scope buildings and work out how much more building safety managers you need. The accountable person should be both introduced early and be consistent for the occupants. As the accountable person through the building safety manager will listen and respond to all the stakeholders involved and ensure their voices are heard. The accountable person is ultimately responsible for the building safe risk assessment that covers the risks present in the building and subsequent checks in the predetermined intervals. So the relationship between the accountable person and the building safety manager will be paramount in order to mitigate any occurring result as the building safety risks. As we as contractors designers will align the completed works and building case report with the associated documents and kept them in an accountable, auditable fashion, maintaining the golden thread that over time will increase consistency. The building safety manager must maintain a safety case report and document any steps that have been taken under Section 73 in relation to those risks. And those are the duties to take to prevent a major incident. The safety case report will be passed to the regulator for review, and the building must be managed as waste. And what kind of things will we like to see in this building case report? We're likely to see the ongoing monitoring of flat entrance properties, communal escapes, and kind of ongoing checks are gone there. So there will be a ongoing responsibility for the building safety manager. So if the building safety manager cannot manage the safety risks, then they must notify the accountable person of this as soon as possible. Therefore, saying is an inherent risk. And likewise, the contractor or constructor will also make the building safety manager aware of any serious risks either present as a result of the works carried out or where they've not already been included in the safe case file. So it's important that contractors and designers can demonstrate that they've carried out their role in accordance with the safety case report. Competent contractors should already have this in place via digital log of works, change control process, progress statements, but please check with the kind of your gateway contractors and organisation, making sure this is in place. So one question might be, how will the industry identify building safety risks to the safety manager or accountable person? So if you look at what ENGIE has done over the last 3 years, we've introduced a compliance team of 15 members plus, and that comprises of external consultants, in-house people. So we look at things like the structural side, the fire side. So we'll have people looking at due diligence on supply chain, specialist supply chain, and kind of primary and secondary testing. We'll look at compartmentation. We'll mix that between on-site inspections and guidance. We'll also run a training program for everybody in the business, and that runs from a site operative level to a middle manager to executive level. So we're really starting to change that culture on what we should be looking for as an industry. Really importantly, we also need to look at how the resident engagement comes through as well. So the building safety manager must evidence how they take resident feedback on board via the resident engagement strategy. And this will identify relevant people for participation in making fire and making safety decisions. The building safety manager will be contactable by residents via working groups. So the building safety manager will be acting as a safety liaison officer to disseminate all this information to the end users. So this could be, the way we see this, well, this could be done as part of a contracting arm or another person, and that really depends on the level of expertise of the building safety manager and the amount of kind of blocks they're looking after. So a key consideration for the contractors will be around how we ensure engagement with the stakeholders, and that complements the client's engagement strategy. This may be come up from designed mailboxes, designated mailboxes, single points of contact, and the usual well-received resident engagement, community events and evenings, just to get that whole dissemination of information through them. Ultimately, the resident engagement should be encouraged participation in order to contribute to the building safety decisions. The enhanced measures that will result in more compliant, safe buildings and free up resources into new homes. The tri-party sign-off of the building control should see all parties working collaboratively as one team. There will be a cost to all these arrangements. So some industries are recommending some estimates in between 15 and 20,000 per in-scope building as an ongoing maintenance, and in between 50 and 80,000 pounds as a one-off cost per regeneration. But the more we invest in this, the more benefits we'll see this. As kind of we spoke about earlier, the best advice I give at present is at the moment, to start working with your future gateway partners. Many of the great clients who we're already working with are thinking along these lines. There's some real uncertain times at the moment, and there'll be budget restraints, there'll be pressures from colleagues, from partners, from finance teams. So we've actually got to start bringing this forward now, to start culturally changing this, to kind of move these kind of recommendations in our day-to-day operations. Thanks for that.
Thank you, James. I'd like to now move to some questions, if that's okay, and start with Mike, if that's all right. In relation to your presentation, some of the points that you drew out, one of the questions that's actually come through on the Q&A is about the movement between the gateways. And I don't want to sort of preempt what you're going to say, but one of the questions is that, you know, do we foresee that completion on some projects may be delayed because basically the movement from the gateways is not permitted by the regulator because people haven't managed safety in the way, duty holders haven't managed safety in the way that they should. What do you think about that, Mike?
Yeah, I think that's a real possibility, and I think it's going to, when the bill's quite clear in saying this is a hard stop, and unless the regulator is satisfied with the information they have, then the duty holder will be told, no, you can't commence works on site, or you can't occupy the building. So I think there's lots of uncertainty there, because until the secondary legislation is introduced, which adds a bit more meat on the bones, if you like, there's a bit of uncertainty in terms of the level of information we're talking about. But I can see there being examples of or instances of people who are, and projects that can't commence on site, and teams and building owners who can't occupy their buildings whilst there's a learning curve. I really think that's going to happen.
Yeah, so do I. I mean, that's exactly how we've interpreted it so far as well. And in terms of, you know, what we think about how we normally, you know, construct works, how we normally contract, do you think this is the end of D&B contracting as we've had previously?
I don't think it's the end of D&B contracting, but I think it will change. D&B is a very popular form of procurement in the residential sector, for obvious reasons. I think clients will need to engage with their main contractors and specialist contractors much earlier than in the process. I think it's going to put some real pressure on single stage design and build procurement. I'm actually struggling to see how the gateway process will work with single stage design and build contracting. If it is going to work, it's going to have to change. What I do think is true management contracting, it won't be conducive to the gateway process, simply because the level of design information that is required to be submitted as part of the gateway approval process just won't be available. So I don't think D&B contracting is dead, but I think it will change.
Yeah, and in terms of value engineering, the use of that term has received a lot of criticism, of course, and it has become something that we're very suspicious of now in the industry. How do you see that being incorporated into projects following the bill, or, you know, the requirements of the new bill?
I think as you say, the term value engineering was frowned upon massively by Dame Judith, because value engineering should be about value, not cost cutting. My view is still that if value engineering is done correctly, it can add value to projects. But we can't have a situation where there's disparity between designer, contractor and building owner. I do think that any changes to design after Gateway 2 is going to be so difficult to administer, in that if those design changes are likely to affect the fire or structural performance of the building, then that change will have to go back to the regulator via the duty holder for approval. Now that I think will be cost and time prohibitive. So I think that the term and the opportunity for value engineering will still exist, but we have to do it earlier in the process, and it have to be part of the gateway to submission. So the opportunity for VE, if you like, post starting on site will be much smaller, or maybe even eliminated. One of the things that we need to be mindful of, though, is sometimes products become unavailable in the market, etc. So companies go bust, etc. So there must be a mechanism for revisiting with the regulator design details and product specification. But I think value engineering after Gateway 2 will be a real challenge.
Yeah, I think so too. James, could I jump over to you now? Obviously, I think Mike's touched on this, you've touched on this. We're waiting for some more prescriptive, explanations as to what we're all meant to be doing. Particularly, and there's been a lot of focus on the accountable persons and what they'll have to do. But what else do you think we should be looking at in terms of what should our clients be looking at now?
I think start implementing these. There's some, generally the RPs are already being really responsive to the bill and already speaking to us about things like this. So I think there's lots of organisations that are further down the line than you actually probably think. They probably don't realise it. Collaborative working and culture has moved on in the last kind of 5 years greatly. I think if you start looking at this, it's the compliance of the building. You've got this other pressure of kind of, should we say, sustainability and climate emergency coming up as well. So if you're spending all that resources and you're doing it and you're putting that correctly in place, you kind of start looking and going, do you want to be going back to that high-rise building in the next 15 years, where you might have a vision to kind of bring your stock up to EPC level Cs? So you might want to dovetail some things into there. This all depends on leaseholders' contribution as well. Obviously, any remedial works, they've got to pay this. So if you can offset some kind of like savings on their energy bills, it's more likely to go down well. But also then the problem with the landlords is and can't charge of any kind of results of an enforcement action. So clients have got to be bold and kind of like and be brave enough for this to kind of like bring it forward and go, what does this building need for the next 30 years?
Yeah, I think so. And obviously we've identified, and well, the bill's identified the role of architects as something that needs, regulation and monitoring, and obviously there'll be some intense scrutiny on that profession. Also, we've touched on things like, designated products, safety critical products, things like that, that we've withdrawn from the market if they present a risk. What other things have you been thinking about in terms of risk?
I think we touched on it a couple of times. I think the insurance world has gone a bit crazy, to be fair. We're hearing things that the premiums have gone up 50, 80%. We're hearing quotes of 300, 400% in over the last 2 or 3 years. So you'd like to think that the draft bill promises this new regulation system that kind of starts identifying these designated products and safety critical products and banning them, that allows the industry to move on with the reasonable amount of risk, and insurance companies can back it. I'm always amazed by how many clients think they're covered, but when you look at it, people are signing contracts and their insurance company are not backing them up. So back to that terminology, back to that design and build thing. Design and build done correctly is fine, but I think the days of getting everything designed up there and putting the risks down to a constructor or contractor are probably going to be shaping differently in the future.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you, James. We have run out of time. I'm sorry that there are lots of questions. Everyone has been so engaged in this topic. But we can't quite get to them all because we're just too short of time, I'm afraid. So thank you so much to Mike and James. I'd like to say that please stay tuned, because our next session is on the regulator sanctions and enforcement with Paul Mooney, Service Director at Asset Management at Salix Homes, Chris Auger, Head of Schemes at BAFE, and Amanda Stubbs, one of my partners at Trowers. So please stay tuned if you can. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome everybody to the morning's final session of Trowers Building Safety mini conference, where we'll be focusing on the Building Safety Regulator, together with proposed sanctions and enforcement measures introduced in the draft bill. With me to discuss this significant area are Paul Mooney and Chris Auger. Paul is the Director of Asset Management at Salix Homes and has been in the business of asset management, compliance and development within the social housing sector in the Northwest for over 25 years. Salix has 18 high-rise resi buildings in Salford City and is part of the government's early adopters programme. So Paul has been working with MHCLG and industry leads on the development and testing of safety cases and participating in the joint regulatory groups Working Group 1 and the Greater Manchester High Rise Task Force. So he's very much at the heart of the test driving some of the new proposals. Chris is Director of Schemes for BFE, the independent registration body for the fire industry, and has responsibility for the development of competence schemes for the fire sector. He is Secretariat of 2 of the Hackett competency working groups, Working Group 2 for installers and Working Group 4 for fire risk assessors, and sits on the Competence Steering Group. Chris trained as a mechanical engineer and has spent most of his working life in the testing, inspection and certification arena. So if anyone knows how to measure competency, I suggest it's Chris. With that thought very much in mind, I'll kick off the session with a brief introduction to the new regulator and its key roles under the new regime before handing over to Paul, who will be looking at the extent to which cultural change will be achieved within the industry, the housing sector and within enforcement practice more generally as a result of the new regulator. Chris will then focus on competency and how it will be demonstrated through procurement and the purchasing power of clients, and how the sector can gear up for better enforcement given the current under-resourcing on both sides of the fence. So briefly then, in terms of the structure of the new regulator and its key roles, the Building Safety Regulator will sit within the HSE. It'll take the form of a new division within the HSE and will report to the Secretary of State. Now, the new regulator is actually the linchpin of this new regime. Its approach to and execution of its functions and powers will determine how successful the new regime is. The explanatory notes to the draft bill make it clear that the government's expectation is that the regulator will take a proactive role and will not limit its regulatory activity to enforcement only. So the regulator will be responsible for all regulatory decisions under the new regime during all stages of the life cycle of a higher risk building. It will also be responsible for overseeing the registration and inspection of higher risk buildings and will have express powers to authorise remedial works, stop non-compliant projects, appoint special measures for failing projects and order the replacement of key fire safety officers. So it's a really wide remit and it's a very powerful body, as in big potential there. So the regulator will establish and consult with 3 advisory committees on building, industry competence and resident representation while developing the new building safety regime. And the regulator's got 3 broad functions and essentially it will exercise these functions with a view to securing the safety of people in or about buildings in relation to risks arising from buildings and improving the standard of buildings. So its first function will be implementation of the new, more stringent regulatory regime for higher risk buildings, which means effectively it's the Building Control Authority in respect of building work on new higher risk buildings. It will be responsible for checking building work to verify that it complies with the building regs, as well as having responsibility for overseeing and enforcing the new regime in the occupational phase 2. Secondly, it will oversee the safety and performance of all buildings. And this is divided into sort of 2 key aspects. It'll oversee performance of the other building control bodies. So in other words, the local authorities and the sort of approved inspectors as we know them. This will involve collecting performance data and will give them the power to impose sanctions for poor performance. It will also involve understanding and advising on existing and emerging building standards and safety risks, including advising on changes to regulations, changes to scope of regime and commissioning advice on risks in and standards of buildings. So again, very wide. And thirdly, it will assist and encourage competence among the built environment industry and registered building inspectors. And there are 2 parts to this third limb of the regulator's workload. It will assist and encourage improvement in the competency of the built environment sector through several functions, including establishing and setting the strategic direction of the proposed industry-led competence committee, carrying out research and analysis, publishing non-statutory advice and guidance, etc. And also establishing a unified building control profession with competency requirements for registration of building control functions that will be common across both public sector, i.e. local authority building control, and the private sector. So in order to assist with carrying out its functions, the regulator is under a duty to establish and operate, or arrange for another person to operate, a system to facilitate voluntary provision of information about building safety to the regulator. And this is a real step change. This is effectively like a sort of whistleblowing provision. And the current proposal is for this function to be fulfilled through the expansion of the confidential reporting on structural safety scheme, which is known as CROSS. Some of you may have come across it. Sits out sort of on the edge of the industry, but actually comments on and is informative as to what is happening on the ground. And finally, the regulator can also ask a relevant authority for assistance in carrying out its functions or direct it to do something. And a relevant authority is the local authority or the fire and rescue authority. So it really is at the sort of hub of all activity to do with regulation across the sector. So it's a big role, and there's major change to it's a major change to the current approach to regulation. So I'm now going to hand over to Paul, who's going to look at how to bring about, or how we might bring about the necessary cultural and behavioural changes that will be needed.
Thanks very much, Amanda. First of all, I must say we obviously welcome the bill. It's been a long time coming, and I think it's great that we're finally seeing some thoughts in terms of how the sector industry is going to be regulated going forward to improve building safety. But if we go back to sort of the call from Dame Judith in terms of her Building and Safer Future report back in May 2018, some of the key priorities were to create an effective regulator, an accountability framework which is clearly set out, introduce clear standards and guidance, and there's information about that in the bill, quite specific about that. Putting the residents at the heart of new building safety, which we will all agree. And then all obviously to create or help create a culture change so there's more responsible building industry and property sector. So having reviewed the draft, and I understand it is the first draft, the bill clearly illustrates how the new regulator will function and the new standards of accountability, a framework right across industry and the housing sector. I think what is less clear is how the bill will actually create the necessary change culture, not just within the industry and housing sector, but also within the regulator, because this is a new regulator that is drawing together separate regulatory bodies in the sector and industry, and that is going to be a challenge. In terms of our experience, we've been fortunate enough to help or work with the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government in quite a few policy design trials, specifically the mandatory occurrence reporting trial, which Amanda mentioned is out there in terms of the work that CROSS have done. And that means there's a process where contractors, installers or anybody who have access to or live in our properties or high-rise buildings can report any issues relating to the building safety. And we found that particularly challenging to get contractors to report issues to us. There's a definite need for them to understand the difference between building safety and the safety of buildings in terms of fire and structure. And even now we're still finding issues where contractors, either through a lack of knowledge or understanding, are not reporting the issues that we expect them to report. Similarly with consultants and architects, some of them are quite behind the curve in terms of their knowledge and understanding of building safety per se, even though there's quite a considerable amount of work being done prior to the publication of the bill. And Dame Judith Hackett has been quite clear that people shouldn't just stand still, they should get on, and there's quite a lot we could be doing, both as a sector and an industry, before the bill becomes real. Stuff we're doing at Salix Homes, based in Salford, is we're doing an assessment at the moment of our cultural understanding of what building safety is and the difference between the building safety of her high-rise blocks and actually doing things in terms of working safely and what that difference means. Also working with their customers to try and get them to understand what their role is and how they can play that very important part in making sure their properties and the wider building is safe and remains safe. And then also there is the building safety charter that's been out there now, and people got the opportunity to contribute to and join and register their support. And that's a really good website where you can go on and have a look at some of best practice that's already out there. So the other thing to probably note, I think, is that the bill is very detailed in its sanctions and penalties. I think it would have been really useful to see how the regulator can actually nurture improve collaborative working and the sharing of best practice, and how working collaborative together as the sector, the industry and the regulator, we can move forward to create safer buildings in the future. Thanks, Amanda.
Thanks very much, Paul. There's obviously plenty to be thinking about there in terms of collaborative working, so far as it is actually possible within the regime. So perhaps, Chris, if I can now ask you for some practical thoughts on how we gear up to ensure that both the regulator and the regulated achieve the necessary competencies to make this new regime a success, please.
Okay, thanks, thanks, Amanda. Okay, so I'm not going to sort of go into any great detail about the bill, because there are other far more qualified and experienced in building matters to talk about that. I'm going to talk primarily from a fire perspective and my my role and involvement with the competency steering group. So, as Paul Nash mentioned earlier on in the presentation in the first session, the CSG, the Competency Steering Group, their report is due out probably, it's imminent really, and we think it's going to be sometime next week. I think it's at a stage now, it's going through its final sense check before it gets into, it goes out for print. Now, in the report, there are almost 60 recommendations that all of the competency working groups have brought together. So, as you can imagine, they're fairly wide-ranging, but there are also some common themes within that. And as you can imagine, from as it's the competency steering group, there's a huge focus on competence within that report. Now, Dame Judith talked in her report of Building a Safer Future back in 2018. She talked about individual competence, but myself, from my perspective, from my background, and actually the views of quite a few others within the CSG, we've been looking at organisational competence. So that will rely on an organisation being competent and employing and deploying competent people to go on site. Now, it's quite a bit of a culture change within the built environment, but we believe that it is the right way to go if you want to increase safety and increase competence on building sites. So it was very interesting listening to Paul this morning about when he was talking about competence and not waiting for legislation, because that's something which has been a focus that throughout the CSG. Is that we should not be waiting for legislation before we actually start to do things. Now, of course, as we all know, we've all been working within our silos. The construction industry work within their silo, the fire industry work within their silos, and from my own perspective, even within the fire sector, there is the passive sector which work within theirs and the active sector which work in theirs. So there's still a lot of work to be done. We still need to start talking to each other, and that is starting to happen. Now, for a long time, fire has been a bit of a poor relation within the construction centre, but thankfully, at long last, this is now beginning to change with the tragic events that happened in June 3 years ago. But so if I get on now a bit onto the regulator's role, now for me, it's very, very important, and it's quite a critical role, of course. But I think not only we've got the level of the building safety regulator, which sits right at the very top of the tree. Actually, I think there's a role to be played by procurement, in this whole piece of work. You know, there's a lot of tenders which are out there where you've got people who are involved in procurement are not as competent as they should be, and they're making decisions based on things that they don't necessarily know about. Now, of course, it's not the role of every procurement officer to be competent in all areas of construction. However, what we think, or I believe, is that they should at least know where to go to actually ask the question. You know, what am I employing the right sort of people here? And there's a big piece of work which has been going on within the Working Group 11 on procurement, where they've been looking at the scoring mechanism for appointing tenders. And I know that, you know, previously and historically, it's always, you know, on many occasions, it's all been about cost, but that is now not as an important factor as it previously was, and competence will actually start to score far more highly than it has done now. Now, for my sins, I also sit on the Bex Strategy Group, which is also mentioned earlier. Now, that group is looking at the overarching standards, the top-down standards for the three key roles. You know, the building safety manager, the principal designer, and the principal contractor. Now, again, that will have a trickle-down effect onto into all of the sectors involved in all of this. Now, there are going to be competence requirements laid out for those particular roles, but also in their duty, as in their principal duties, will be to actually employ and deploy competent people. Now, my work within WG2 for installers is effectively the bottom-up approach. So in WG2, we're looking at frameworks where we're looking at organisations and individuals to be able to demonstrate their competence. It's not going to be prescriptive, so we're not going to tell them exactly what they need to have. However, all sectors across the built environment should be working to a particular framework, and that's what we're going to be, and that's what we have recommended. So it's going to be very interesting to see how this all pans out, and of course the work of the regulator. We understand they're actually going to be working quite closely with the fire and rescue services, because they're going to be coming at it from specifically a fire perspective. So I could go into talking about the resource issues, which was touched upon this morning. I'm very mindful of the time that I've been taking up already, but from an enforcement perspective, yes, traditionally Reg 38 has been poorly enforced in the past, and we want to see an absolute halt to that practice, and it may well have been down to resource, but we think with the new building safety regulator in place, it will have more teeth and it will have more opportunity to act and enforce the legislation. And we're hoping for the fire and rescue services as well to actually get far more involved in all of this, because again, they're under-resourced, as we know. So we're looking for a greater involvement from them, and to actually start enforcing legislation which is not only currently there but will be coming on in the future. And one final little point I'd just like to add, that I think with all that's been said above about the regulator, about enforcement, if we start raising the bar and setting the bar at a higher level of competence, we should get a reduction in the need for enforcement. It sounds quite bizarre, but actually we don't really want to see enforcement in some respects, because what we should be aiming for is higher levels of competence, so that enforcement is not required. But we do understand that it will be there for the future. Thanks, Amanda.
Thanks very much, Chris. I think that's really interesting. A lot of practical issues there arising out of how you actually bond together the different constituent parts that will be forming the new regulator. And clearly there is a big job, and it's going to take a lot of money and a lot of people and sort of resourcing to get it set up appropriately at the outset. And bond it together. But I would just add a sort of word of encouragement in that it's not unprecedented, in that back in 1995, the Environment Act merged the National Rivers Authority Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Pollution and the Waste Regulation Authorities to become the Environment Agency for England and Wales. And its constituent parts were 3 very different regulators doing very different jobs with different approaches to enforcement. And there were a lot of critics at the time that it would dilute the individual expertise in the constituent parts. But it did work. And in fact, interestingly, the most proactive and arguably aggressive regulator, which at the time was the National Rivers Authority, became the driving force of the new agency and the sort of the dominant dog. So it will be very interesting to see to what extent the new evolving regulator is sort of driven by the sort of building control inspectors or the fire safety inspectors or the health HSE inspectors, who are all sort of going to have to learn a sort of a new way of working. So that's the end of the formal part of our session. And now we've got a short time for some questions. Please use the chat function if there's anything specific you'd like to address to the panel members. It's at the bottom of the screen. We've already had a number of questions, so I'll just kick off with asking Paul about how you consider residents of high-risk buildings are likely to be affected by the new regime, particularly because residents have obviously got some statutory duties on them themselves. So, you know, they're in it, as you know, directly as well as indirectly.
They've already got some specific obligations within the tenancy agreements or leasehold agreements. But what this, first and foremost, hopefully makes their lives easier and their buildings safer. So they've got, they're in much safer buildings that they can enjoy properly. But we're hoping also that it increases their awareness and their responsibility for both their own dwellings and the communal areas within the buildings they occupy. And that responsibility is to help the accountable person and building safety manager to ensure those properties remain safe. And that can't happen without their cooperation. And we would hope that cooperation is freely given, because we know certainly in our sector we still have continued issues with no access for certain building safety work, such as gas servicing and electric servicing. So we would hope that that would reduce under the new regime. And we work collaborative with residents to make sure those buildings remain safe.
Thank you. I think that's right. I think there's been a continuing thread through this morning's sessions that this is not going to be about following a list of prescriptive things that each party's got to do. It's going to be about thinking a bit more inquisitively about what needs doing and actually working collaboratively and sort of actually taking responsibility in each individual party's position for the safety of the building, rather than just following a list of things we've got to do, and once we've ticked all those, we're done. So I think that is right, and residents are very much going to be one of those parties now. Chris, one of the questions that's come in is relating to what extent do you see the draft legislation being drafted in a way that will improve competence with the built environment? You know, will key competencies become mandatory, do you think, you know, for the building safety manager, the principal designer, etc., fire risk assessors?
I think the short answer is, and in the short term, I think no competencies won't be mandatory. I mean, and you know, we have to think back to and remember what Dame Judith said, which is she is expecting the industry to get its house in order so that we don't have to have legislation. Now, you know, third-party certification, which is a measure of competency, is widely accepted and used across the fire sector. And you know, we find it is the way of actually ensuring that you get competent people operating and installing and maintaining systems. Now, that's been accepted within the fire sector for quite a few years now. You know, we've been running schemes for, you know, one of our schemes on fire detection alarm systems has been running for many, many years without any real objections, and it works. Now, of course, you know, that's the whole thing about the whole part about third-party certification. It's a voluntary a voluntary process. Nobody is forcing anybody to do it. Any schemes that we produce are they follow British standards. So in the event of any sort of incident that happens, you know, you know, the people with the curly wigs will be looking at, you know, what standards have been followed, what legislation is actually out there. Now for commercial, in commercial buildings, we've got the fire safety order, but we also, but from a competency perspective, it just talks about having a competent person. You know, there's nothing in the fire safety order which talks about, you know, well, what does competency look like? So that's where you get standards, and that's where you get schemes getting involved. Now, if I could just briefly touch on one of the roles now, where I think that mandatory requirement for competence should exist is in the role of fire risk assessors, because I think, you know, the building regs cover the construction of the building, but what happens once the building is occupied, and a fire risk assessment has to be carried out on that. Now, I've been involved in a Home Office discussion on the whole resource issue of fire risk assessors. You know, and currently there are around about 400 fire risk assessors which sit on registers, but they're not all of those 400 people are actually competent to work on these higher risk buildings. So in the first step of it, we'd like a mandatory requirement for anybody working on higher risk buildings should actually be, that should be actually mandatory. And then of course that will have a trickle down effect onto the others, because there are many thousands of fire risk assessors out there, but not all of them are registered. And they are of varying quality and competence throughout. You know, you can get some unregistered individuals who are extremely competent out there, but if you go to the other end of the scale, you've got people out there who are offering a bucket shop a price for what they should be doing on some of these higher risk buildings. And you know, we need to start stamping out the you know, the incompetent people that are out there, because unfortunately there are far too many, and you know, they might be very good at marketing and advertising themselves as being competent, but actually this will be down to the end user, the customer, the procurer, to actually ask the question, well, okay, demonstrate to me that you are actually competent. And when they can do that, that's the thing that they should be looking at. So, you know, they shouldn't be just specifying, they should be actually verifying that that individual is competent to do the work that they're contracted to do.
Thanks very much, Chris. I think that's absolutely right. One of the questions that's come in through the chat has sort of suggested this very point, that we could end up with a sort of whole tranche of people who are sort of fresh from college or from their sort of competency course that they've done, just citing regulations at you and sort of telling you, you know, this is what you've got to do. And I think the message that is coming through across all the sessions this morning is you've got to think bigger than this. You've got to look up above the regulations specifically and look at what you're actually seeing on the ground and within the building and how it's operating, and try and think sort of inquisitively, I would say, about how the building is structured and how the safety is operating. So I think that's all we've got time for. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but I just wanted to thank both our speakers very much, Paul and Chris, and also to the audience for participating and clearly engaging with the topic. I'm sorry we haven't had time for more of your questions. This is the last session for today, but there's more tomorrow. Day 2 of the Trowers and Hamlins mini conference will kick off at 10:30 with a session on the in-occupation phase and a competency of the accountable person and building safety manager. So hopefully you'll be able to join us again for that. And in the meantime, thank you very much and goodbye.